There comes a moment when even the hardest heart remembers what it feels like to care. For Duke Alaric, that moment came at a dusty village auction, watching an old bay horse that nobody wanted. He had spent 15 years being feared and respected. War had changed him. Politics had made him cold. But this horse was different. It was old and tired, just like he felt inside. The horse stood alone in the corner while people walked past without looking. Alaric saw himself in that moment. Without thinking, he bought the horse for more than it was worth. It was the first kind thing he had done in years. He thought he was just helping an old animal. But this horse knew secrets about his family that had been hidden for decades. Could one tired duke and one forgotten horse uncover the truth that powerful people had buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The road to Raven's Hollow estate stretched before Duke Alaric like a thread, connecting his bitter present to a past he had tried to forget. Dust swirled beneath his horse's hooves, not the old bay from the auction, but his war charger, a magnificent black stallion that had carried him through countless battles. The irony wasn't lost on him that he rode in comfort, while his act of compassion walked behind. Led by a stable boy who couldn't have been more than 16, the countryside rolled past in waves of golden wheat and emerald pastures, dotted with stone cottages whose chimneys sent lazy spirals of smoke into the autumn air. It should have been peaceful, this return to the land of his birth. Instead, each familiar landmark felt like another weight added to his shoulders. The old mill, where he had played as a boy, now stood with a broken wheel. The bridge over Winding Creek, where his father had taught him to fish, bore fresh scars from recent floods. 15 years. 15 years since he had left as an idealistic young man, eager to serve his king and prove himself worthy of the Raven's Hollow name. He returned as something else entirely, a weapon honed by war, sharpened by political necessity, and tempered in the fires of betrayal that burned in every noble court across the realm. The medal in his breast pocket felt heavier than armor. The King's Cross of Valor, they called it, awarded for his decisive victory at the Battle of Thornwick Pass. What they didn't mention in the histories was how he had achieved that victory, by sacrificing an entire company of young soldiers, boys barely older than the stable hand walking behind him now. Military genius, the generals had called it. Necessary losses for the greater good. He touched the medal through the fabric of his traveling coat, its edges sharp enough to cut. Once it had filled him with pride. Now it served only as a reminder of what he had become, in service to a crown that had rewarded him with exile disguised as honors. "Take time to recover from your ordeals," the king had said with that politician's smile. "Rest at your estate. We shall call upon your services again when the realm has need." The translation was clear enough. He had become too dangerous, too effective, too willing to do what others could not. Even his allies had begun to fear him, and fear was a currency that eventually devalued itself. Better to send him away before he became a threat to those who had created him. As the familiar gates of Raven's Hollow came into view, Alaric felt something twist in his chest that might once have been called homecoming. The iron bars were black with age and neglect, twisted into the shapes of ravens that seemed to watch his approach with hollow eyes. Beyond them, the estate stretched across rolling hills like a patchwork quilt left too long in the sun. Its colors faded, but its bones still strong. The manor house sat at the heart of it all, a testament to the Raven's Hollow legacy built from grey stone that had weathered centuries of storms. 3 stories tall with towers at each corner, it had once been a fortress before his great-grandfather had softened its edges with gardens and wide windows. Now those gardens grew wild, and several of the windows stared blindly out with broken panes. Edmund Whitmore emerged from the front door before Alaric could dismount, moving with the careful dignity of a man whose bones remembered harder days, but whose spirit refused to bend. The estate steward had served 3 generations of Ravenhollow dukes, and at 72 he showed no signs of slowing down. His hair had gone white as winter snow, but his green eyes remained sharp as spring grass, Your Grace, Edmund said, offering a bow that was precisely correct, respectful but not servile, acknowledging rank without surrendering dignity. "Welcome home, Edmund." Alaric swung down from his saddle, surprised by the genuine warmth in his voice. Here, at least, was something unchanged by time and circumstance. "You look well as can be expected for an old man left to manage an estate with half the staff and twice the work." Edmund's smile took any sting from the words. "But we've managed, Your Grace. We always have." Martha Hendricks appeared next, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron as she hurried down the front steps. Where Edmund had aged gracefully, Martha had aged practically. Her brown hair streaked with silver, but her movements still quick and sure, her face lined by years of laughter more than sorrow. She had been the estate's head cook and unofficial mother to every child who had ever lived within these walls. "Master Alaric," she said, and there was no formal address in her greeting, only the warmth of a woman who had once bandaged his scraped knees and listened to his boyhood troubles. "You look thin and pale. Have they been feeding you nothing but hardtack and worry at that court?" Despite everything, Alaric found himself smiling, the first genuine smile he had worn in months. "Something like that, Martha. Your cooking was always better than royal feasts. Flattery won't excuse 15 years of neglect," she scolded, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "We'll fix that soon enough. I've got a roast in the oven and fresh bread cooling. You'll eat properly while you're home, if I have to tie you to a chair." Home. The word settled over him like a familiar coat, worn soft by time, but still capable of providing warmth. When had he stopped thinking of Ravenshollow as home? Somewhere between his first campaign and his last betrayal. The word had become just another place on a map, another destination in a life spent moving from one battlefield to the next. The stable boy approached with the old bay horse, and Alaric was struck again by the animal's presence. Up close, he could see that the horse had once been magnificent. The lines of its breeding showed in the arch of its neck and the intelligence in its dark eyes, but years had worn it down like water-wearing stone. Grey touched its muzzle, and old scars marked its flanks, not from abuse, but from a hard life honestly lived. "Put him in the eastern pasture," Alaric instructed. "The one near the old oak. Good grass there, and shelter from the wind." The boy nodded and led the horse away, but not before Alaric noticed something odd. The animal's ears pricked forward as they passed the manor house, and its steps quickened as if it recognized something familiar. Strange, for a horse that had supposedly spent its life in the village. "Unusual purchase, if I may say so, Your Grace," Edmund observed as they watched the horse disappear around the corner of the house. "The villagers say you paid 3 times what anyone expected for a horse that age." "Perhaps I've grown sentimental in my old age," Alaric replied, though he couldn't quite explain the impulse that had driven him to bid on the animal. Something about its dignity in the face of rejection had spoken to him. "Or perhaps you've simply remembered what it means to show mercy," Martha said quietly. "That's not a weakness, Master Alaric. That's what makes a good man." They walked toward the house together, past gardens that had once been his mother's pride. Roses grew wild now, their blooms small but persistent, while herbs had escaped their neat borders to mingle with weeds and wildflowers. It should have been chaos, but instead it felt like freedom, beauty without constraint, growth without purpose beyond the simple act of living. Inside, the manor showed its age more clearly. Dust sheets covered furniture in the great hall, and portraits of long-dead Ravenhollow lords watched from walls that needed fresh paint. But the bones of the house remained strong, its stone walls thick enough to keep out winter cold, and its hearths large enough to warm the largest gathering. His father's study remained exactly as he had left it, and Alaric paused in the doorway, struck by the weight of memory. Duke Aldwyn had been a quiet man, more scholar than warrior, more given to books than battles. He had died when Alaric was barely 17, passing in his sleep one winter night with no warning and no goodbye. The physicians had called it a weak heart, though his father had seemed strong enough just days before. "I've kept it dusted," Edmund said from behind him. Thought you might want to use it when you returned. Thank you." Alaric stepped inside, running his fingers along the edge of the massive oak desk, where his father had worked on estate business and correspondence with other lords. Books lined every wall, their leather bindings rich with age and care. Philosophy and history, poetry and natural science. His father had been a man of broad interests and deep thoughts. How different might things have been if Duke Aldwin had lived to guide his son through those crucial early years? Would Alaric have chosen the path of war and politics, or might he have stayed home to tend the estate and study the mysteries that had so fascinated his father? The questions had no answers, only the hollow ache of possibilities forever lost. That evening, as Martha had threatened, Alaric found himself fed better than he had been in months. The roast was perfect, tender enough to cut with a fork and seasoned with herbs from the wild garden. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, butter churned that morning, and ale brewed from hops grown on the estate itself. These simple pleasures tasted better than any royal banquet he had attended. Afterward, he walked the grounds as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. The old bay horse stood in the eastern pasture, and to Alaric's surprise, it watched his approach with something that might have been recognition. When he reached the fence, the animal walked over and allowed him to stroke its neck. "What's your story, old friend?" he murmured. "What have you seen that put such wisdom in your eyes?" The horse nickered softly and nuzzled his shoulder, a gesture so gentle and trusting that Alaric felt something crack in the armor he had built around his heart. For a moment he was just a man standing in a field, sharing the simple communion between human and animal that had existed since the dawn of time. As he turned to go back to the house, he noticed something that made him pause. The horse was watching the manor house with intense focus, its ears forward and its body alert, as if it were waiting for something or someone, but that was impossible. The horse was a stranger here, bought at a village auction and brought to unfamiliar ground. Yet something in its posture suggested otherwise, as if this place held memories that went deeper than mere geography. Troubled by thoughts he couldn't quite name, Alaric made his way back to the house as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tomorrow he would begin the work of rebuilding his life and his relationship with the estate he had neglected for too long. Tonight he would sleep in his childhood bed and try to remember what it felt like to be home. But sleep, when it came, brought dreams of his father's face and the nagging sense that the old bay horse knew, secrets that even the Duke of Ravenshollow had forgotten. 3 days passed in the comfortable rhythm of estate. Business and gradual reacquaintance with a life lived at walking pace rather than the urgent gallop of war and politics. Alaric met with tenant farmers, reviewed accounts with Edmund, and began to understand just how much his absence had cost the lands he was sworn to protect. Yet for all the work that needed doing, he found himself drawn repeatedly to the eastern pasture and the old bay horse that grazed there with increasing contentment. The animal had settled into estate life with an ease that surprised everyone. Most horses needed time to adjust to new surroundings, but this one moved about the grounds as if it had been born there. Martha commented on it while serving breakfast on the 4th morning, her practical nature puzzled by the horse's behavior. "Strange thing," she said, setting down a plate of eggs and bacon that would have fed 2 men. "Young Tom says the horse knew exactly where the water trough was, walked right to it without being led. And yesterday, when the gate to the lower pasture was left open, it went straight there, like it knew the best grazing spots." Alaric paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "Perhaps all horses have the same instincts about water and grass." "Perhaps," Martha agreed, but her tone suggested she didn't quite believe it. "Still seems odd for a beast that's supposedly never been here before." After breakfast, Alaric decided to satisfy his curiosity with a closer examination of his purchase. He found the horse standing beneath the old oak, its head raised as if listening to something only it could hear. As he approached, the animal turned to watch him with those intelligent dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding. "What are you thinking about, old fellow?" Alaric asked, running his hand along the horse's neck. The coat was rough with age, but clean, and beneath his fingers he could feel the solid muscle of an animal that had lived a working life. The horse nickered and moved toward the manor house, stopping after a few steps to look back as if inviting Alaric to follow. When he didn't immediately respond, the animal repeated the gesture, this time with more urgency. "You want to show me something?" Alaric found himself asking, feeling slightly foolish for speaking to a horse as if it could understand. But the animal's behavior was so deliberate, so purposeful, that it seemed almost human in its communication. He decided to follow, curious to see where the horse would lead. They walked together across the grounds, the horse setting a steady pace that led them away from the well-traveled paths and toward a section of the estate that Alaric hadn't visited since boyhood. Here the formal gardens gave way to wilder growth, and old stone walls disappeared beneath curtains of ivy and climbing roses. The horse stopped before what appeared to be a solid wall of vegetation, pawing at the ground with one hoof and whinnying softly. Alaric pushed aside the tangle of vines and discovered beneath them the outline of an old door, its wooden surface weathered almost smooth by decades of neglect. The iron hinges had rusted, but the basic structure remained sound. More interesting still was what hung from a nail driven into the door's frame. An old leather bridle, cracked with age but still recognizable. The horse pressed its muzzle against the worn leather and whickered, a sound that seemed almost mournful. Alaric lifted the bridle from its resting place, surprised by its weight. This was no simple headstall, but a working harness decorated with brass fittings that caught the morning light. As he examined it more closely, something metallic fell from one of the leather straps and landed in the grass at his feet. It was a key. Small but elaborately crafted from brass that had tarnished to a deep golden brown. Engraved into its surface was the Raven's Hollow family crest, a raven perched on a shield, but executed in a style he didn't recognize. The metalwork was older than anything he remembered from the estate, more ornate and detailed than the simpler designs his father had preferred. "Where did this come from?" he murmured, turning the key over in his palm. The horse watched him intently, as if waiting for him to understand something important. The old door proved to be unlocked, its ancient mechanism yielding to gentle pressure despite years of disuse. Beyond lay a narrow corridor, carved from the living rock beneath the manor house, its walls damp with centuries of accumulated moisture. Carved niches held the remnants of old torches, their iron brackets green with verdigris. Alaric had no memory of this passage, though he had explored every corner of Ravenshollow as a boy. His father had never mentioned it, nor had Edmund in all their discussions of estate business. How could such a thing exist without his knowledge? The brass key felt warm in his hand as he made his way down the corridor, guided by dim light filtering through cracks in the stonework above. The passage ended at another door, this one made of oak, reinforced with iron bands and secured with a lock that matched his key perfectly. The mechanism turned with surprising smoothness, and the door swung open to reveal a chamber that took his breath away. It was a study, but unlike any room he had ever seen in the manor house proper. The walls were lined with shelves that held not books but artifacts, maps, documents, small carved objects, and curiosities that spoke of interests far broader than estate management. A desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers held down by stones that had been carved into the shapes of ravens. Candles in elaborate holders had burned down to stubs, their wax pooling on the wood in shapes that suggested they had been used recently. Though dust covered everything else in the room, Alaric approached the desk with the reverence due a shrine, for that was what this felt like. A sacred space where someone had pursued knowledge that couldn't be shared in the light of day. The papers were covered with his father's handwriting, though they bore no resemblance to the estate correspondence he remembered from Duke Aldwin's regular study. These were notes about people and places, diagrams of relationships between noble houses, and sketches of what appeared to be code or cipher systems. Names were connected by lines that suggested intrigue and alliance, betrayal and blackmail. At the center of it all, written in his father's careful script, were the words Shadow Council, underlined multiple times and surrounded by question marks. One document made Alaric's blood run cold. It was a list of names, and beside each name was a date and a method. Duke Harrington, poison 1474. Lord Blackwood, riding accident 1475. Count Ashford, fever 1476. The list went on, each entry recording what appeared to be the death of a nobleman, but with details that suggested these deaths were neither natural nor accidental. At the bottom of the list, in fresher ink, was his father's name, Duke Aldwin Ravenshollow. The question mark seemed to mock him from the page, a symbol of uncertainty that had proven all too prophetic. His father had died just months after making this entry, supposedly of heart failure in his sleep. But if this room and its contents were genuine, then Duke Aldwin had been investigating a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the nobility, a conspiracy that might have cost him his life. Alaric sank into the chair behind the desk, overwhelmed by the implications of what he had discovered. All these years, he had mourned his father as a good man taken too early by natural causes. The possibility that Duke Aldwin might have been murdered, and that his death might have been connected to this investigation, changed everything he thought he knew about his family's history. More disturbing still was the realization that his father had been working alone, pursuing dangerous knowledge in secret without confiding in anyone, not even his teenage son, who would inherit both title and danger. Why had Duke Aldwin chosen silence over safety? What had he discovered that was worth risking his life to expose? The horse whinnied from somewhere above, its voice echoing down through the stone passage like a summons. Alaric carefully gathered the most important documents and made his way back to the surface, his mind reeling with questions that demanded answers. As he emerged from the hidden door, he found the old bay horse waiting for him, its dark eyes patient and knowing. The animal nuzzled his shoulder gently, and for a moment Alaric could have sworn he saw approval in its gaze, as if it had been waiting years for someone to discover what lay hidden beneath Ravenshallow's peaceful exterior. "You knew, didn't you?" he whispered, stroking the horse's neck. "Somehow, you knew this was here." The horse nickered softly and turned toward the manor house. But its steps were different now. Not the aimless wandering of an animal exploring new territory, but the purposeful gait of a creature with important work to do. As they walked back together, Alaric felt the weight of legacy settling over his shoulders like a mantle passed from father to son. Whatever conspiracy his father had died investigating, whatever secrets the Shadow Council had killed to protect, the truth was still hidden somewhere in the documents and artifacts of that underground chamber. The old bay horse had given him the key to his father's secrets. Now he had to find the courage to unlock them all, no matter where they led or what they cost him. The game his father had died playing was far from over, and Alaric was only beginning to understand the rules. That night, Alaric could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's handwriting spelling out the names of dead men, each one a nobleman who had supposedly died of natural causes. The brass key lay on his bedside table, catching moonlight from the window, and throwing tiny shadows on the wall like accusatory fingers. By dawn, he had made his decision. He would return to the hidden chamber and examine every document, every map, every artifact his father had collected. If Duke Aldwin had truly been murdered for what he knew, then the truth deserved to see daylight. No matter how dangerous it proved to be, the old bay horse was waiting for him when he reached the eastern pasture, as if it had sensed his intention. Together they made their way to the concealed door, and Alaric noticed that the animal's movements had taken on a different quality, alert and focused, like a soldier preparing for battle. The chamber felt different in the morning light that filtered down through the hidden passage. Where yesterday it had seemed like a shrine to forgotten mysteries, today it felt like a war room where his father had mapped the movements of enemies who wore the faces of friends. Alaric lit the candles with flint and steel from his belt, filling the space with warm, flickering light that brought the walls alive with dancing shadows. Then he began to read in earnest, starting with the documents that bore the earliest dates and working his way forward through months and years of careful investigation. What emerged was a picture of corruption that reached far deeper than he had imagined. The Shadow Council wasn't simply a group of ambitious nobles seeking personal advantage. It was a systematic conspiracy to control the throne itself through manipulation, blackmail, and, when necessary, murder. They installed their allies in key positions, eliminated those who threatened their plans, and orchestrated events to serve their interests while maintaining the illusion of natural political evolution. His father's notes revealed a web of connections that linked seemingly unrelated deaths across decades. Duke Harrington had been investigating irregularities in royal tax collection before his sudden poisoning. Lord Blackwood had been planning to expose corruption in the royal guard when his horse had supposedly thrown him from a cliff. Count Ashford had been gathering evidence about stolen crown lands when fever had claimed him in the space of 3 days. Each death had been carefully staged to appear accidental or natural, but the pattern was unmistakable once it was laid bare. The Shadow Council eliminated threats with ruthless efficiency, always leaving themselves beyond suspicion while removing anyone who might challenge their growing influence. Most chilling of all was his father's growing certainty that the conspiracy had infiltrated the highest levels of the royal court. Names that Alaric recognized from his own years of service appeared throughout the documents. Men he had trusted and respected, now revealed as potential enemies. Lord Blackthorne, who had served as his mentor during his early military career, was mentioned repeatedly as a possible member of the inner circle. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Blackthorne had been present at court during every major decision of Alaric's career, guiding his choices and shaping his opportunities. If the man was truly part of the Shadow Council, then Alaric's entire adult life had been orchestrated by the same people who had killed his father. A rustling sound from above reminded him that the horse was waiting, and when he climbed back to the surface, he found the animal pacing restlessly near the concealed door. As soon as Alaric appeared, the horse moved toward another section of the estate, once again inviting him to follow. This time they walked to the old stable complex, a series of buildings that had once housed dozens of horses, but now stood mostly empty. The main stable was still in use, but the horse led him past it to a smaller building that had been converted to storage decades ago. Inside, beneath piles of old tack and farming equipment, the horse began pawing at the floor with increasing urgency. Alaric moved aside the clutter and discovered that several of the floorboards had been cut and could be lifted to reveal a hidden compartment below. What he found there made his hands shake as he lifted it into the light. It was a leather-bound journal, smaller than the documents in the secret chamber, but written in the same careful script. This wasn't his father's investigation notes. This was something more personal, more immediate. It was Duke Aldwin's private diary from the months before his death. The entries began calmly enough, recording ordinary events and observations about estate business. But as Alaric read on, he could trace his father's growing alarm as pieces of the conspiracy began to fit together in his mind. Duke Aldwin had started his investigation believing he was tracking isolated incidents of corruption. By the end, he knew he was hunting something far more dangerous. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before his father's death, made Alaric's blood turn cold. I can no longer deny what the evidence suggests. The Shadow Council is real, and their influence reaches even to those I have trusted most. I fear for Alaric's safety should anything happen to me, for he is innocent of their schemes, and therefore dangerous to their future plans. I have hidden what proof I have gathered, but I dare not act openly until I know the full extent of their network. May God forgive me if my caution costs more lives. The final entry was dated the night before Duke Aldwin's death. Thomas has agreed to help me get word to Baron Ashworth, who I believe can still be trusted. If something should happen to me, Thomas knows where the evidence is hidden. I pray I am wrong about the danger, but I can no longer ignore the signs. The horses have been acting strangely, and I fear someone has been watching the estate. If I do not wake tomorrow, may someone find this record and finish what I could not. Thomas. The name appeared throughout the later entries. A stable hand who had apparently been Duke Aldwin's only confidant in the investigation. But Alaric had no memory of anyone by that name working at Raven's Hollow. If Thomas had been helping his father, what had become of him after Duke Aldwin's death? The answer came to him with sudden, horrible clarity. If the Shadow Council had killed his father, they would not have left alive the one person who knew about the investigation. Thomas, whoever he had been, was almost certainly dead as well. Another victim of a conspiracy that eliminated all threats to its secrecy. But if that was true, how had the old bay horse known where to find the hidden compartment? How had it led him to the concealed door and the brass key that unlocked his father's secrets? Alaric looked at the horse with new understanding. The animal wasn't just intelligent, it was purposeful in a way that suggested deep familiarity with these places and their significance. If Thomas had been a stable hand, then he would have worked closely with the estate's horses. It was possible, even likely, that one of those horses had been his particular responsibility. You belonged to him, didn't you? Alaric asked softly. Thomas was your master, and when he died, you ended up at that village auction. Forgotten and abandoned, the horse turned its dark eyes on him with an expression that seemed almost human in its sadness and determination. Here was an animal that had outlived its master and carried his secrets through years of neglect and hardship, waiting for the day when someone would understand the importance of what it guarded. Edmund's voice, calling his name, interrupted his thoughts, and Alaric quickly secured the journal in his coat before leading the horse back toward the main estate. The steward was waiting for him near the manor house, his expression troubled in a way that made Alaric's newly awakened suspicions stir uneasily. "Your Grace," Edmund said as they approached, "I've just received word from the village. There are strangers asking questions about your return, well-dressed men with the look of court officials about them. They're being polite but insistent. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Alaric had been home less than a week, and already the wrong people were taking notice of his presence. If the Shadow Council was real and still active, his investigation into his father's death would not go unnoticed for long." "What sort of questions?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "About your plans. Your Grace, how long you intend to stay, what business brings you back to Raven's Hollow, whether you've taken an interest in your father's old papers." Edmund's green eyes were sharp with concern. "I thought you should know." The game was already in motion, Alaric realized. The same forces that had killed his father were stirring again, and his presence at Raven's Hollow had triggered their attention. He was no longer simply a duke returning home to rest. He was a threat that needed to be assessed and, if necessary, eliminated. But this time, they would find their target better prepared than Duke Aldwin had been. This time, they faced not a scholar pursuing dangerous knowledge alone, but a battle-tested warrior who had learned to recognize enemies before they could strike. The horse nickered softly beside him, and Alaric found himself drawing comfort from the animal's presence. Whatever came next, he would not face it alone. He had allies now: Edmund's loyalty, Martha's fierce protectiveness, and the strange partnership of an old bay horse that carried the memories of a murdered man. The Shadow Council had won their first victory through surprise and isolation. They would not find their second victory so easily achieved. The coded passages in his father's journal proved more challenging than Alaric had anticipated. Duke Aldwin had been thorough in protecting his secrets, using a cipher that substituted symbols for letters in patterns that shifted according to rules known only to the writer. After hours of frustration in the hidden chamber, Alaric began to understand why his father had needed Thomas's help. This was work that required more than one mind to accomplish safely. He spread the most promising documents across the desk and lit additional candles. determined to break at least one section of the code before night fell. The horse waited patiently above, occasionally whinnying as if to remind him that daylight would not last forever. The breakthrough came when he noticed that certain symbols appeared more frequently in passages that mentioned specific names. His father had been clever rather than creating an entirely artificial cipher. He had built upon patterns that already existed in the documents, using the natural repetition of common words and phrases as the foundation for more complex substitutions. Once he understood the basic principle, the rest began to fall into place. Slowly, painstakingly, words emerged from the symbolic chaos. Blackthorne met with Ashworth's steward 3 days after the funeral. Payment confirmed through usual channels. Next target identified as Lord Pemberton, who grows too curious about crown lands in the Northern Territories. Lord Pemberton. Alaric remembered him, an elderly duke with a passion for hunting and a reputation for honest dealing in all his affairs. If the Shadow Council had targeted him, then he was likely already dead. Though the news might not yet have reached Ravenshollow, more disturbing was the casual reference to payment and usual channels, suggesting a level of organization that went far beyond simple conspiracy. The Shadow Council operated like a business, with established procedures for identifying threats, authorizing eliminations, and compensating those who carried out their orders. As the afternoon wore on, Alaric decoded enough passages to understand the scope of his father's final investigations. Duke Aldwin had identified at least 12 members of the Shadow Council's inner circle, including several men who held positions of trust within the royal court. Their influence extended through the military, the church, and the merchant guilds that controlled much of the kingdom's trade. Most shocking of all was his father's growing certainty that the Shadow Council had been manipulating royal policy for decades, engineering wars and treaties to serve their interests while enriching themselves through advanced knowledge of the Crown's intentions. The recent conflict that had made Alaric's military reputation, the war that had supposedly broken out due to border disputes and ancient grievances, might have been orchestrated from the beginning as a means of consolidating power and eliminating inconvenient noble houses. The implications made him physically sick. How many men had died in battles that existed only to serve the Shadow Council's agenda? How many of his own tactical victories had been nothing more than moves in a larger game, played by men who saw soldiers as expendable pieces on a board? His hands were shaking when he finally climbed back to the surface, the decoded passages carefully hidden within his coat. The horse greeted him with unusual urgency, prancing and tossing its head as if trying to communicate something important. When Alaric didn't immediately understand, the animal began walking toward the village road, stopping frequently to look back and encourage him to follow. They had gone perhaps half a mile when Alaric saw what had alarmed his unusual companion. A group of horsemen approached along the main road, their mounts fresh and well cared for, their clothing marking them as men of means and authority. Even at a distance, he could see the careful way they observed the countryside, noting landmarks and defensive positions with the practiced eyes of men accustomed to planning campaigns. These were not simple travelers seeking directions or merchants conducting business. These were scouts, gathering information about the estate and its approaches with methodical precision. The Shadow Council was moving faster than he had expected, already positioning themselves for whatever action they deemed necessary. Alaric backed into the cover of a grove of oak trees, keeping the horse close beside him as he watched the riders pass. There were 5 of them, all armed with swords and wearing the kind of practical traveling clothes that could pass unremarked in any village while concealing the equipment of professional soldiers. The leader was a man. Alaric recognized Sir Marcus Dalton, a knight who had served under Lord Blackthorne during the border campaigns. Dalton was competent but ruthless, the sort of man who followed orders without questioning their morality, so long as the pay was sufficient. His presence here could mean only one thing: the Shadow Council was preparing to act. After the riders disappeared toward the village, Alaric made his way back to the manor with growing urgency. The horse seemed to sense his mood, maintaining a quick pace that spoke of shared understanding about the danger they faced. He found Edmund waiting in the great hall, his weathered face grave with concern. The steward's hands held a letter bearing an official seal, and his posture suggested news that would not be welcome. "Your Grace," Edmund said without preamble. "This arrived by royal messenger an hour ago. The man insisted on delivering it personally and waiting for your response. The letter bore the seal of Lord Blackthorne himself, pressed into black wax that seemed ominous in the afternoon light filtering through the tall windows." Alaric broke it carefully, aware that Edmund was watching his reaction with the sharp attention of a man who had served noble houses long enough to recognize political danger. The message was brief, but loaded with implications. "My dear Alaric, I trust you are finding your rest at Raven's Hollow both peaceful and restorative. I find myself in the vicinity on royal business and would be honored to call upon you tomorrow evening for dinner and conversation about matters of mutual interest. Your faithful mentor and friend, Lord Blackthorne." The politeness of the language couldn't disguise the underlying threat. Blackthorne was not requesting a social visit. He was announcing his intention to assess the situation personally and determine what action, if any, needed to be taken regarding Duke Aldwin's son. "Shall I prepare accommodations for his lordship?" Edmund asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be complicated. "Yes," Alaric replied after a moment's thought, "but discreetly ensure that our most valuable items are secured, and that Martha knows to prepare only simple fare. I want Lord Blackthorne to see exactly what he expects, a war-weary duke seeking quiet retirement, with no interest in anything beyond estate management and peaceful contemplation." Edmund nodded, understanding the game they would need to play, and the matter of those strangers in the village. "They'll be Blackthorne's men, gathering information before his arrival. Make sure our people know to speak of nothing but routine estate business, repairs needed, crops planted, the normal concerns of country folk with no knowledge of wider affairs." That evening, Alaric returned to the hidden chamber with his father's journal and the most recent decoded passages. By candlelight, he read through Duke Aldwin's growing paranoia in the weeks before his death, tracing his father's realization that Lord Blackthorne, his trusted friend and counsellor, had been reporting his activities to the Shadow Council from the beginning. One entry, written just days before the end, revealed the depth of his father's betrayal. "I have been a fool. Blackthorne has known about my investigation from the start, feeding me information that seemed helpful while guiding me away from the most dangerous truths. The documents I thought were secret were shared with my enemies, and the allies I believed I could trust were chosen by the very people I sought to expose. Thomas alone remains loyal, but even he cannot protect me from the web I have woven around myself." The final entry was barely legible. Written in a hand that shook with fear or illness, "They will come for me tonight. I can see it in Blackthorne's eyes when he thinks I'm not watching. The poison will be subtle, something that mimics heart failure, leaving no trace for physicians to discover. I have told Thomas where to hide the evidence if I do not survive to use it myself. May God forgive us all for the evil we have allowed to flourish in shadows." Alaric closed the journal with hands that trembled with rage rather than fear. His father had died knowing exactly who would kill him and why, helpless to prevent his own murder because the very man he had trusted for guidance was the architect of his destruction. But Duke Aldwin had made one crucial error. He had underestimated Thomas's devotion and resourcefulness. The stable hand had not only hidden the evidence as instructed, but had apparently trained the old bay horse to lead others to its location when the time was right. Through years of patient waiting, Thomas had achieved from beyond death what Duke Aldwin could not accomplish while living. The sound of hoofbeats on the stone passage behind him made Alaric turn, expecting to see the horse that had become his unlikely partner in this dangerous game. Instead, he found Edmund descending the hidden stairs, his expression troubled but determined. "I thought I might find you here, Your Grace," the steward said calmly. "The horse led me to the door when I went looking for you." For a moment, Alaric considered denying everything, maintaining the pretense of ignorance that might protect them both. But Edmund's steady gaze suggested such deception would be pointless. "How long have you known?" he asked instead. "About the hidden chamber?" "Since your father built it 23 years ago." "About what he was investigating?" "I suspected, but I never asked questions that might endanger us both." Edmund stepped closer to the desk, his eyes taking in the scattered documents and decoded passages. "About Thomas and what really happened to him. I've known that for 15 years, Your Grace, and I've been waiting for someone to come looking for the truth." The admission hit Alaric like a physical blow. "You knew Thomas was murdered?" "I knew he disappeared 3 days after your father's funeral, along with his favorite horse, that old bay you bought at the village auction. I knew he'd been asking questions about who might have visited the estate the night your father died. And I knew he'd been planning to travel to Baron Ashworth with information that might have been important." Edmund's voice was steady, but heavy with old grief. "When neither he nor the horse ever returned, I drew my own conclusions. Why didn't you tell me when I was young? Why let me believe my father died naturally?" Edmund sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. "Because you were 17 years old, Your Grace, and because the same people who killed your father would not have hesitated to kill his son if they perceived any threat. I kept my silence to keep you alive, praying that someday you would be strong enough and smart enough to find the truth on your own." The weight of 15 years of protective deception settled between them like a bridge, finally ready to bear the load it was designed for. Edmund had been more than a loyal steward. He had been a guardian, keeping dangerous knowledge safe until the boy he protected became a man capable of wielding it effectively. "Lord Blackthorne comes tomorrow," Alaric said quietly. "I know. And he won't come alone, nor will he leave without the answers he seeks." Edmund met his eyes directly. "The question now, Your Grace, is what we intend to do about it." The old bay horse whinnied from somewhere above them, its voice echoing through the stone passage like a call to battle. Thomas's horse, carrying Thomas's memories and Thomas's purpose, reminding them both that some debts could only be paid in full. "We're going to finish what my father started," Alaric said. And for the first time since returning to Ravenshollow, his voice carried the authority of a man who had chosen his battlefield and would not retreat from it. The night before Blackthorne's arrival, Alaric lay awake, planning strategies and contingencies with the methodical precision he had learned in a dozen military campaigns. But this would be unlike any battle he had fought before, a contest where the wrong word or expression could prove as deadly as any sword. And where his opponent held every advantage of preparation and position, he rose before dawn and made his way to the stable, where the old bay horse waited with the patient alertness that had become familiar. Together, they walked the grounds of Ravenshollow in the grey pre-dawn light, and Alaric found himself speaking aloud his thoughts and fears to the animal that had become his most trusted confidant. "He taught me everything I know about reading men's intentions," he said quietly as they paused, beside the reflecting pool where his mother had once fed swans. How to spot lies, how to recognize ambition disguised as loyalty, how to survive in a world where trust is a luxury that can cost you your life. The irony is that he trained me so well, I might actually be able to detect his deceptions if I can keep my emotions from clouding my judgment. The horse nuzzled his shoulder gently, a gesture that had become their ritual of mutual comfort. In the animal's dark eyes, Alaric sometimes imagined he could see Thomas's spirit offering encouragement from beyond death, urging him to complete the mission that had cost both their lives. As the sun climbed higher, he returned to the manor to find Martha already bustling about the kitchen, preparing what would appear to be a simple country meal, but which Alaric knew would be among the finest dining experiences of Blackthorne's recent memory. The woman's pride in her craft would never allow her to serve anything less than perfection, regardless of the political implications. "Will you be needing anything special prepared, Master Alaric?" she asked, not looking up from the pastry she was rolling with quick, efficient strokes. "Any particular wine brought up from the cellars?" "Nothing elaborate, Martha. Lord Blackthorne expects to find a weary soldier seeking simple pleasures, not a duke entertaining in the grand manner." He paused, watching her work with the same attention to detail she had shown since his boyhood. "But if we have any of Father's best Burgundy left, perhaps that would be appropriate for such an honored guest." Martha's hands stilled for just a moment, long enough to let him know she understood that this dinner would be anything but simple social courtesy. "I believe there are still a few bottles in the locked wine cellar, the ones your father kept for the most special occasions. I'll make sure they're properly prepared." The morning passed in careful preparations that would create the appearance of routine hospitality while concealing the true nature of the evening's encounter. Edmund supervised the cleaning of the formal dining room, ensuring that everything appeared properly maintained but not ostentatious. Alaric spent time in his father's study, arranging books and papers to suggest the interests of a man seeking peaceful intellectual pursuits rather than dangerous political investigations. Most importantly, he and Edmund worked together to secure the hidden chamber and remove any trace that it had been recently accessed. The documents were carefully relocated to a new hiding place known only to the two of them, while the chamber itself was left to appear as it had for decades, dusty, undisturbed, and seemingly forgotten by everyone at Ravenshollow. Lord Blackthorne arrived precisely at sunset, as Alaric had expected. The man's sense of timing had always been impeccable, calculated to create maximum psychological impact while maintaining the pretense of social courtesy. He rode alone up the main drive, though Alaric had no doubt that Sir Marcus Dalton and his men were positioned nearby, ready to respond if their master's signal indicated that more direct action was required. From his window, Alaric watched his father's old friend dismount and hand his reins to the stable boy, with the easy confidence of a man who had never doubted his welcome anywhere. Blackthorne was still an impressive figure at 55, tall and straight-backed, with silver hair that caught the evening light, and the kind of commanding presence that made other men defer to his judgment instinctively. Watching him approach the front door, Alaric felt a complex mix of emotions that threatened to undermine his carefully maintained composure. This was the man who had guided him through his first military campaigns, who had offered counsel during his darkest moments at court, who had seemed to embody everything noble and honorable about service to crown and country. The knowledge that it had all been a performance designed to manipulate and control him felt like a wound that would never properly heal. But beneath the pain lay something harder and more dangerous, the cold rage of a professional warrior who had finally identified his true enemy. Edmund announced Lord Blackthorne's arrival with the formal courtesy due a guest of his rank, and Alaric descended to the great hall to play his part in the deadly theatre that was about to unfold. "Alaric, my boy." Blackthorne's greeting seemed genuinely warm, complete with the sort of embrace that a beloved mentor might offer to a protégé he hadn't seen for too long.
"You look well."
"The country air agrees with you far better than that poisonous atmosphere at court, Lord Blackthorne," Alaric replied, allowing himself to be embraced while fighting the urge to reach for the dagger at his belt. "What an unexpected pleasure. Your letter mentioned royal business in the area. Nothing that need concern you, I'm sure. Some tedious matter about tax assessments and land grants that requires my personal attention. Dull work, but someone must ensure the Crown's interests are properly served." Blackthorne stepped back to study him, with eyes that missed nothing. "I confess I was worried about you after your service at court. You seemed strained during those final weeks." The observation was carefully calculated to probe his mental state and assess whether he posed any threat to the Shadow Council's interests. Alaric forced himself to smile with what he hoped appeared to be genuine warmth rather than the bitter irony he felt. "The transition from military to civilian life has been more difficult than I expected," he admitted, allowing a note of vulnerability to enter his voice. "I find myself questioning many of the decisions I made in service to the Crown. wondering if the costs were truly justified by the results achieved. It was a masterful performance, he thought, the confession of a man struggling with guilt and disillusionment, exactly the sort of weakness that the Shadow Council could exploit or dismiss as non-threatening. Blackthorn's expression softened with what appeared to be paternal concern, though Alaric now recognized it as the practiced sympathy of a predator assessing wounded prey. Such doubts are natural for any man of conscience who has seen war's realities, Blackthorn said gently. But you must not allow them to overshadow the good you accomplished. Your victories saved countless lives and secured the realm's borders for generations to come. They moved toward the dining room, where Martha had laid out a meal that struck exactly the right balance between country simplicity and aristocratic refinement. As they settled into their chairs, Alaric found himself remembering other dinners with this man, conversations where he had sought guidance and received what he believed to be wisdom born of genuine affection and concern. How much of his adult life had been shaped by advice designed not to help him succeed, but to ensure he remained useful to the Shadow Council's purposes. How many of his military strategies had been subtly influenced by suggestions that served their interests rather than the Crown's? The questions multiplied with each course, each shared memory, each moment of false camaraderie. "I've been thinking about my father lately," Alaric said during a pause in their conversation about mutual acquaintances at court. "Returning to Raven's Hollow has awakened many memories of the time before his death. I find myself wondering what sort of man he truly was. Beyond the father I knew as a boy, Blackthorn's reaction was so subtle that anyone without Alaric's training might have missed it entirely. A slight stiffening of his posture, a momentary pause before lifting his wine cup. The briefest flicker of something that might have been calculation behind his carefully composed features. "Duke Aldwyn was one of the finest men I ever knew," he said after that tiny hesitation. "Scholarly, thoughtful, devoted to his family and his duty. His death was a great loss to all who valued wisdom and integrity in public service." The praise sounded genuine, even heartfelt, but Alaric now understood that Blackthorn was capable of counterfeiting any emotion when it served his purposes. The man had attended Duke Aldwyn's funeral and delivered a moving eulogy about friendship and tragic loss, all while knowing exactly how and why his victim had died. "I sometimes wonder what he would have made of the changes in the realm since his passing," Alaric continued, watching for any reaction. Whether his scholarly interests would have led him to investigate the various irregularities that seemed to have become more common in recent years. This time the reaction was more pronounced, a tightening around Blackthorn's eyes that suggested the conversation was moving into dangerous territory, but his voice remained steady as he responded. "Your father was indeed curious about many things, but he was also wise enough to understand that some questions are better left unasked. A man can drive himself to distraction seeking patterns and conspiracies where none exist, especially when grief or isolation clouds his judgment." The warning was delivered with the gentle authority of a mentor offering guidance to a beloved student, but Alaric heard it clearly for what it was, a threat disguised as concern, a reminder that excessive curiosity about certain subjects had already proven fatal once in the Raven's Hollow family. The conversation continued through the evening with the careful courtesy of two swordsmen circling each other, each testing the other's defenses while maintaining the pretense of friendly discourse. Blackthorn spoke of court gossip and political developments, while Alaric played the part of a retired soldier with no interest in affairs beyond his estate's borders. But beneath the surface pleasantries, both men were gathering information and assessing threats. Alaric watched for signs that Blackthorn suspected his investigation into his father's death, while the older man probed gently for any indication that Duke Aldwyn's son posed a danger to the Shadow Council's continued operations. As they moved to the library for brandy and more intimate conversation, Blackthorn's questions became more pointed. He inquired about Alaric's plans for the estate, his intentions regarding marriage and heirs, his thoughts about returning to court service when his period of rest concluded. Each question seemed innocent enough, but taken together, they painted a picture of a man assessing whether the Duke of Ravenshollow would be better served as an ally or removed as a potential obstacle. "I must admit," Blackthorne said, as he settled into one of the leather chairs that had been Duke Aldwyn's favourites, "I was surprised to hear you'd made a purchase at the village auction. It seems an unusual way for a duke to acquire livestock." The comment was delivered casually, but Alaric felt his pulse quicken. If Blackthorne knew about the horse, then his intelligence network was functioning exactly as effectively as the document suggested. The Shadow Council was watching his every move, analyzing his behavior for signs of the dangerous curiosity that had killed his father. "A moment of impulse," Alaric replied with what he hoped appeared to be mild embarrassment. "The poor creature looked so forlorn that I found myself bidding before I'd properly considered the wisdom of the act. My steward was less than pleased with the extravagance. Compassion is hardly a fault, though it can sometimes lead a man into situations he might have avoided with more careful thought." Blackthorne sipped his brandy thoughtfully. "I'm told the horse was quite old, possibly beyond useful service. An interesting choice for a man with access to the finest breeding stock in the kingdom." The observation contained an implicit criticism and a subtle warning. Men of their rank were expected to make decisions based on practical considerations rather than emotional impulses. And excessive sentiment could be seen as a sign of weakness that enemies might exploit. "Perhaps I saw something of myself in the animal," Alaric said, allowing a note of melancholy to enter his voice. "Both of us passed our prime, both of us cast aside when our usefulness to others came to an end. There seemed a certain justice in offering it comfort in its declining years. It was exactly the sort of self-pitying observation that would fit the role he was playing, a once powerful man, now questioning his worth and seeking meaning in small gestures of kindness." Blackthorne's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine sympathy, though Alaric now understood that the man's ability to simulate sincere emotion was one of his most dangerous weapons. "You underestimate your continued value, my boy. A man with your experience and reputation will always find doors open to him, opportunities to serve the realm in ways that matter. The king has not forgotten your contributions, nor have those of us who recognize true merit when we see it." The reassurance was carefully crafted to sound supportive while actually serving as a recruitment pitch. Blackthorne was offering him a path back to relevance and power, but only if he proved willing to serve the Shadow Council's interests rather than pursuing inconvenient investigations into past injustices. "I appreciate your confidence," Alaric replied, "though I confess I'm not certain I have the stomach for the intrigues and compromises that seem necessary for advancement in the current political climate. Perhaps I've grown too accustomed to the simple clarity of military command, where enemies can be identified and objectives achieved through straightforward action." The comment was designed to probe Blackthorne's reaction to the suggestion that he found court politics distasteful, a position that might make him unsuitable for recruitment but also potentially dangerous if he decided to oppose rather than ignore the Shadow Council's activities. But therein lies your greatest strength," Blackthorne said with enthusiasm that seemed genuine. "Men of principle are rare in any age, but especially valuable in times when moral clarity is needed to guide difficult decisions. The realm needs leaders who can act decisively when lesser men would hesitate or compromise." It was a masterful response, reframing Alaric's supposed distaste for political complexity as a virtue that made him more valuable rather than less suitable for the Shadow Council's purposes. If he could be convinced to lend his military reputation and noble lineage to their cause, they would gain a powerful asset. If he proved too rigid in his principles to be useful, he would need to be eliminated before he could cause trouble. The evening stretched on, with more of the same careful verbal fencing. each man probing the other's intentions while revealing as little as possible about his own plans and knowledge. By the time Blackthorn took his leave, both had learned what they needed to know, that the game between them was far from over, and that the stakes were higher than either had initially assumed. Alaric stood at his window and watched his guest ride away into the darkness, knowing that within days, perhaps hours, the Shadow Council would make their decision about how to handle the potential threat he represented. If they concluded that he could be controlled or recruited, they would begin the process of drawing him deeper into their web of influence and complicity. If they decided he was too dangerous to leave alive, they would move quickly to eliminate him before he could cause further problems. Either way, the period of cautious observation was coming to an end. The next morning brought disturbing news from the village. Edmund arrived at breakfast with reports that the strangers who had been asking questions about Alaric's activities had departed during the night, but not before visiting the local tavern where they had bought drinks for anyone willing to share gossip about the Duke's recent behavior. They were particularly interested in your purchase of the old horse, Edmund reported as he poured coffee with hands that remained steady despite his obvious concern. Asked several people if they'd noticed anything unusual about the animal, whether it had seemed to recognize the estate grounds or show familiarity with the surroundings. The fact that they were investigating the horse specifically meant they had some suspicion about its significance, possibly knowledge of its connection to Thomas and the secrets he had died protecting. If the Shadow Council understood that the animal might be a link to Duke Aldwyn's investigation, then Alaric's time for gathering evidence and planning his next moves was running shorter than he had hoped. There's something else. Your Grace, Edmund continued with obvious reluctance. The blacksmith mentioned that one of the strangers seemed particularly interested in the old bridle that came with the horse, asked detailed questions about its age and craftsmanship, almost as if he recognized it from somewhere. The news hit Alaric like a physical blow. If they knew about the bridle, they might also know about the brass key it had contained and the secrets that key had unlocked. The Shadow Council's intelligence network was more extensive than his father's documents had suggested, reaching into every aspect of the conspiracy they thought they had kept hidden. He found the old bay horse in the eastern pasture, grazing peacefully beneath the oak tree, where Thomas had once sought shelter from summer heat and winter storms. The animal looked up at his approach with those intelligent dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding beyond mere animal instinct. They know about you, don't they? Alaric said softly as he stroked the horse's neck. They remember Thomas and what he tried to do, and they're beginning to suspect that his mission isn't finished. The horse nickered gently and nuzzled his shoulder with the familiar gesture that had become their ritual of comfort and communication. But today there was something different in the animal's manner, an alertness that suggested it too sensed the changing nature of the danger they faced, as if responding to some signal only it could detect. The horse began walking toward the manor house with the purposeful gait that Alaric had learned to recognize as important. They made their way to the hidden chamber one more time, where the animal led him not to the documents they had already discovered, but to a section of wall that looked identical to every other stone surface in the room. But when Alaric pressed against it, following the horse's insistent nudging, he discovered that several of the stones moved slightly, revealing a gap just large enough for a man's hand to reach inside. What his fingers found there made his heart race with excitement and terror in equal measure. It was a small leather pouch, carefully sealed against moisture and time. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a collection of items that Thomas had apparently considered too dangerous to leave with the other evidence. A signet ring bearing arms he didn't recognize, several letters in a hand he had never seen, and most shocking of all, a miniature portrait of a woman whose face was hauntingly familiar. The woman in the portrait bore a striking resemblance to his mother, but she was clearly someone else, older, with subtle differences in the shape of her eyes and the curve of her mouth. The clothing and jewelry she wore marked her as nobility, But from a time before Alaric's birth, on the back of the portrait, in his father's careful script, was a single word: Catherine. He had never heard the name before, but something about the woman's face stirred memories that felt almost like recognition. Who was Catherine, and why had his father considered her portrait important enough to hide with his most dangerous secrets? The answer, when it came to him, was so shocking that he nearly dropped the precious artifact. If this woman resembled his mother so closely, she might be a relative, perhaps the sister his mother had mentioned in childhood stories, but whom Alaric had never met. And if she was connected to the Shadow Council's activities, then the conspiracy his father had died investigating might have roots that reached back even further into his family's history than he had imagined. The old bay horse watched him with patient understanding as he carefully returned the items to their hiding place, but not before memorizing every detail of Catherine's face and the questions her portrait raised. Whatever role she had played in the events that had cost both his father and Thomas their lives, he was determined to uncover her story and understand how it connected to the danger that now threatened his own survival. Time was running out, but with each new discovery, he felt closer to the truth that had been worth dying for. The Shadow Council might have superior numbers and resources, but they faced an opponent who had learned patience from 15 years of hiding and determination from the memory of those who had died seeking justice. The game was far from over. The revelation came 3 days later, hidden in a compartment so cleverly concealed that Alaric might never have found it without the old bay horse's persistent guidance. The animal had been restless since Blackthorn's visit, pacing the grounds with an urgency that seemed to build with each passing hour. On the third morning, it led him not to the familiar hiding places they had already explored, but to the saddle that had come with the horse from the village auction. Alaric had examined the saddle before, noting its quality despite its age, but he had not looked closely enough. The horse stood perfectly still as he ran his hands along every surface, searching for the irregularity that the animal seemed determined he should find. What he discovered made his blood run cold with shock and betrayal so profound that he had to grip the saddle's pommel to keep his balance. Sewn into the underside of the saddle's skirt, protected by layers of leather and hidden by years of accumulated dirt, was a small cloth pouch. Inside, wrapped in silk that had once been fine, but was now stained with age, was a signet ring that bore the arms of House Blackthorn. But this was not some family heirloom or ceremonial piece. This ring was stained with what could only be blood, dark brown patches that had soaked into the gold and refused to fade despite the passage of years. Engraved inside the band, in letters so small they were barely visible, was a date that corresponded exactly to the night of his father's death. Thomas had not simply witnessed Duke Aldwin's murder, he had somehow obtained proof of Lord Blackthorn's direct involvement in the crime. The stable hand had risked his life to gather evidence that would expose not just the conspiracy, but the identity of his master's killer. And he had died for that courage before he could deliver justice. But the implications went far deeper than simple revenge. If Thomas had Blackthorn's ring, he must have taken it during a struggle or found it at the scene of the crime. The blood could only have come from Duke Aldwin himself, making this not just evidence of murder, but a trophy kept by the killer, a memento of his victory over a man who had trusted him completely. Alaric sank to his knees in the straw of the stable, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the betrayal this discovery represented. Lord Blackthorn had not simply been a member of the Shadow Council reporting on Duke Aldwin's activities, he had been the assassin personally tasked with eliminating a threat to their interests. The man who had raised Alaric after his father's death, who had guided his career and shaped his values, who had seemed to embody everything noble about service and loyalty, had been the murderer who destroyed his family and stole his childhood. Every memory of Blackthorn's kindness and guidance now revealed itself as calculated manipulation, designed to control and direct the son of his victim. The paternal affection Alaric had treasured, the wise counsel he had valued, the opportunities for advancement that had seemed to prove his worth, all of it, had been orchestrated by the man who had killed his father and then assumed the role of surrogate parent to better control the potential threat represented by Duke Alwyn's heir. The horse nickered softly and nuzzled his shoulder with unusual gentleness, as if the animal understood the emotional devastation this discovery had unleashed. In the beast's dark eyes, Alaric imagined he could see Thomas's spirit offering comfort and encouragement, reminding him that the truth, however painful, was the weapon he needed to achieve justice. With shaking hands, he rewrapped the ring and returned it to its hiding place. This evidence was too dangerous to move or examine further until he was ready to use it, but knowing of its existence changed everything about his situation. He was no longer simply investigating a historical conspiracy. He was gathering evidence against a living enemy who had shaped his entire adult life through lies and manipulation. As he made his way back to the manor, Alaric's mind raced with the implications of what he had learned. If Blackthorn had killed Duke Alwyn personally, then the Shadow Council trusted him with their most sensitive operations. If he had taken the time to acquire and keep a bloody trophy from the murder, he was not simply a practical assassin, but someone who took personal satisfaction in his crimes. And if he had spent 15 years positioning himself as Alaric's mentor and guide, then everything about the young Duke's career and reputation had been crafted to serve the Shadow Council's interests. How many of his military victories had been achieved using intelligence provided by Blackthorn? How many of his strategic decisions had been subtly influenced by advice from his father's killer? How many young soldiers had died following battle plans that served the Shadow Council's agenda rather than the Crown's legitimate interests? The questions multiplied with each step, creating a picture of manipulation so comprehensive that Alaric wondered if he had ever made a truly independent decision in his adult life. Even his recent choice to retire from court and return to Raven's Hollow might have been encouraged by Blackthorn as a means of keeping him isolated and controllable while the Shadow Council pursued their broader objectives. But if that was true, then they had made a critical error in their calculations. By sending him home to the place where his father's secrets were hidden, they had given him access to the evidence and allies he needed to expose their crimes. The old bay horse, Edmund's loyalty and Martha's fierce protectiveness were resources they had not anticipated, and the combination was proving more dangerous to their interests than they had imagined. Edmund was waiting for him in the great hall, his weathered face grave with the kind of concern that suggested bad news. The steward held a letter bearing official seals, but his posture indicated that the message's contents were more troubling than routine correspondence would warrant. "Your Grace," Edmund said without preamble. "This arrived by royal messenger an hour ago." The man rode hard to deliver it and departed immediately, as if he feared being associated with its contents. The letter bore the seal of Baron Ashworth, the same man Duke Alwyn had planned to contact through Thomas before his death. The wax was black rather than the traditional red, and the parchment felt heavier than normal correspondence, as if weighted with significance beyond its apparent simplicity. Inside, Ashworth's message was brief, but loaded with implications. "Your Grace, I have received disturbing reports about activities at Raven's Hollow that suggest you may have inherited more than land and title from your late father. If you possess any materials or knowledge that Duke Alwyn intended to share with me 15 years ago, your life is in immediate danger. The same forces that silenced him are moving against you. Trust no one from court, especially those who claim to be your friends. Come to Ashworth Castle immediately. If you value your survival, bring everything you have found and tell no one of your departure. Time grows short. Baron Ashworth." The letter's urgency was unmistakable, but it raised as many questions as it answered. How had Ashworth learned about Alaric's investigation? What reports had he received and from whom? Most troubling of all, how could he know that danger was imminent unless he had sources of intelligence within the Shadow Council itself? Edmund, Alaric said carefully. "Has anyone else shown unusual interest in our affairs recently? Any visitors or messages that seemed routine but might have been reconnaissance?" The steward's expression darkened with understanding. "Yesterday morning, a merchant claiming to sell fine horses visited the estate. He asked to see our stock and seemed particularly interested in the bay you purchased. When I accompanied him to the pastures, he spent more time studying the manor's approaches and defensive positions than examining the animals. And you didn't think to mention this earlier? I thought it might be connected to Lord Blackthorn's visit. Perhaps an associate gathering additional information for his report. But now," Edmund paused, his green eyes sharp with realization. "Now I suspect the man was assessing how difficult it would be to reach you if more direct action became necessary." The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. The Shadow Council had concluded that Alaric posed too great a threat to be allowed to continue his investigation, and they were positioning themselves for an assault on Ravenshollow that would eliminate both him and any evidence he might have gathered. Blackthorn's dinner visit had not been a social call or a recruitment attempt. It had been a final assessment to determine whether persuasion might succeed where threats had failed. How quickly can we secure the most important documents and prepare for departure? Alaric asked, his military training taking over from the shock and emotional turmoil of the past hour. "Within 2 hours, Your Grace, if we pack only essentials and travel light." "But may I ask where we're going?" Alaric showed him Ashworth's letter, watching the steward's face carefully for any reaction that might suggest divided loyalties or hidden knowledge. But Edmund's response was exactly what he hoped for: immediate. Understanding of the danger and practical focus on the steps needed to ensure their survival. Ashworth. "Castle is 3 days hard riding if we take the old forest roads," Edmund said after reading the message twice. "Longer if we try to avoid the main routes, but much safer if the Shadow Council has men watching the highways." "Can you arrange fresh horses and supplies without arousing suspicion?" "Martha's nephew runs the posting station at Millfield, half a day's ride north. If we can reach him, he'll provide whatever we need without asking questions that might endanger us all." Edmund paused, studying the letter again. "Your Grace, Baron Ashworth mentions bringing everything you've found. Does that include the horse?" The question struck him like a revelation. In all his planning and preparation, he had somehow forgotten that the old bay horse represented not just a source of information, but living proof of Thomas's story and the Shadow Council's crimes. The animal was evidence that walked and breathed, a witness that could corroborate the documents and artifacts they had discovered. More than that, the horse was a link to his father's final months and the stable hand who had died trying to protect Duke Aldwyn's secrets. To abandon the animal now would be not just tactically foolish, but a betrayal of the trust that had guided him to the truth. "Yes," he said firmly, "the horse comes with us. If Thomas trained him to preserve evidence and lead the right person to it, then he might have other secrets yet to reveal." They spent the next hour in careful preparation that would appear routine to any observer, but which positioned them to depart quickly when the moment came. Martha prepared travel food under the pretense of restocking the pantry, while Edmund arranged for the selection of horses and equipment under the guise of routine maintenance. Most importantly, they worked together to create a careful record of everything they had discovered, copying the most crucial documents and creating detailed notes about the location of evidence they couldn't safely transport. If something happened to them during the journey to Ashworth Castle, future investigators would at least have a guide to the truth they had died protecting. As evening approached, Alaric made one final visit to the hidden chamber beneath the manor. By candlelight, he examined the most dangerous documents one last time, committing names and connections to memory in case the physical evidence was lost or destroyed. The full scope of the Shadow Council's influence was staggering, a network that reached into every aspect of the kingdom's governance, from the royal treasury to the military command structure to the church hierarchy that provided moral authority for political decisions. They had been manipulating events for decades, engineering wars and peace treaties, arranging marriages and successions, eliminating threats and promoting allies with a patience and sophistication that made them nearly invisible to their victims. But their very success had created vulnerabilities they might not recognize. Their network was so extensive that it required constant communication and coordination, creating opportunities for their messages to be intercepted or their agents to be identified. Their confidence in their control had made them careless about concealing evidence, assuming that their victims would never live long enough to threaten their interests. Most critically, they had underestimated the power of loyalty and love to preserve dangerous knowledge across generations. Thomas's devotion to Duke Aldwin, Edmund's protection of Duke Aldwin's son, and even the old bay horse's patient guardianship of buried secrets had created a chain of preservation that the Shadow Council had never anticipated as he prepared to leave Ravenshollow, possibly forever. Alaric felt the weight of responsibility settling over him like armor he had worn in countless battles. He was no longer simply seeking justice for his father's murder, though that remained his driving motivation. He was now the keeper of secrets that could expose decades of treason and corruption, the potential instrument of justice for dozens of victims whose deaths had been disguised as accidents or natural causes. The Shadow Council had created their own nemesis by murdering Duke Aldwin and assuming they could control his son through manipulation and false affection. They had taught him to be ruthless and efficient, to think strategically and act decisively, to recognize enemies and eliminate threats. Now all those skills would be turned against them by the very man they had shaped to serve their interests. The old bay horse was waiting for him when he emerged from the chamber for the last time, its eyes bright with what seemed almost like anticipation. Tomorrow, they would begin a journey that would either expose the truth and achieve justice, or end in death for all who had dared to challenge the Shadow Council's power. But tonight, for the first time since returning to Ravenshollow, Alaric felt something that had been missing from his life for 15 years, a sense of purpose that came not from serving others' interests, but from pursuing a cause that was truly his own. Whatever tomorrow brought, he would face it as his father's son rather than Lord Blackthorn's protégé, fighting for truth rather than the lies that had shaped his entire adult life. Dawn came grey and cold, with mist rising from the meadows like spirits of the dead, reluctant to leave the world of the living. Alaric stood at his bedroom window, watching the grounds of Ravenshollow emerge slowly from the darkness, knowing it might be the last time he would see the estate that had shaped his earliest memories and sheltered his father's deepest secrets. The old bay horse stood in the eastern pasture, exactly where Thomas had trained it to wait, patient and alert despite the early hour. Even at this distance, Alaric could see the animal's readiness in the set of its head and the tension in its stance. Like a soldier preparing for battle, the horse understood that today would bring either victory or death, and it was prepared for either outcome. Edmund appeared at the door with coffee and the grim expression of a man who had spent the night making final preparations for a journey that might end in disaster. The steward had changed from his usual estate clothing into the practical traveling gear of a man prepared to ride hard and fight if necessary, and Alaric noticed the outline of weapons concealed beneath his cloak. "The supplies are ready, Your Grace," Edmund reported quietly. "Martha has prepared enough food for a week's travel, and I've selected the 3 strongest horses from our stable. The documents are secured in waterproof cases, and I've arranged for messages to be sent to Baron Ashworth should we fail to arrive within 5 days. And the estate? What provisions have you made for its protection while we're away?" "Martha will remain with a skeleton staff to maintain the appearance of normal operation. I've left sealed instructions for her to follow if we don't return. Arrangements that will ensure the truth about your father's death eventually reaches the right authorities. Even if we're not alive to deliver it ourselves, The precautions were prudent, but they underscored the deadly seriousness of the game they were about to play. The Shadow Council would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their interests, and they had demonstrated their willingness to murder innocents to protect their secrets. By the time this day ended, Ravenshollow might be in a state without a duke, Edmund might be dead, and the old bay horse might be the only surviving witness to the truth they had died protecting. But there was no alternative now except forward motion toward whatever fate awaited them. The evidence they had gathered was too dangerous to leave hidden indefinitely, and Baron Ashworth's warning suggested that time was running out faster than they had anticipated. They departed through the estate's rear gates, using paths that would not be visible from the main road where watchers might be stationed. The old bay horse followed without lead or guidance, moving with the sure-footed confidence of an animal that understood its role in the drama unfolding around it. Edmund rode point, his eyes constantly scanning the countryside for signs of ambush or pursuit, while Alaric brought up the rear with his hand never far from the sword at his side. For the first hour, they encountered nothing more threatening than early-rising farmers heading to their fields and merchants preparing for market day. But as they neared the forest roads that would provide cover for the next stage of their journey, Edmund raised his hand in the signal for immediate halt. "Riders approaching from the south," he said quietly, pointing toward a dust cloud rising above the tree line. "Moving fast and in formation. That's not normal travel, that's pursuit." Alaric counted at least 6 horses, possibly more, riding at the sustained gallop that suggested urgent business rather than casual travel. The timing and direction were too convenient to be coincidental. Someone had discovered their departure and was moving quickly to intercept them before they could reach the relative safety of Ashworth's protection. How long until they reached this position? He asked, studying the terrain for defensive advantages or escape routes. 20 minutes, perhaps less, if they're willing to push their mounts beyond sustainable pace. But we have options. There's an old hunting trail that branches off half a mile ahead. Rough ground that will slow heavily laden horses, but which we can navigate if we're willing to abandon the pack animals. It was a devil's choice. Maintain their supplies and evidence, but risk capture, or travel light and fast, but arrive at Ashworth Castle without the documents needed to prove their accusations. But the decision was made easier by the behavior of the old bay horse, which had begun moving toward the hunting trail before either man had spoken, as if the animal possessed some instinct about the safest path forward. "The horse knows something we don't," Alaric said, urging his mount to follow. "Thomas trained it well. If it thinks that trail offers our best chance, I'm inclined to trust its judgment." The hunting trail proved to be exactly as challenging as Edmund had predicted, a narrow track that wound through dense forest and rocky terrain, forcing them to ride single file at speeds that tested both their horsemanship and their horses' endurance. But it also provided the concealment they needed, shielding them from observation while the sound of their passage was muffled by thick undergrowth and forest canopy. Behind them, they could hear the pursuing riders reaching the main road and then pausing, presumably to search for signs of their quarry's direction. The delay would buy them precious time, but it also confirmed that their enemies possessed the tracking skills necessary to follow even a carefully concealed trail. As they pushed deeper into the forest, the old bay horse continued to lead with the confidence of an animal following a route it had traveled before. Thomas had apparently used these paths during his final, desperate flight from Ravenshollow, teaching his companion the way to safety that he himself had never lived to complete. The revelation struck Alaric with the force of sudden understanding. The horse wasn't simply carrying them toward Ashworth Castle, it was completing the mission that Thomas had died, attempting 15 years ago. The stable hand had planned this exact journey, mapped these routes and trained his mount to guide future allies along the path to justice he could not finish. "Himself, the horse has been here before," he called to Edmund as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of rocky slope. "Thomas used these trails when he fled the estate. The animal is taking us exactly where he was heading when the Shadow Council caught up with him. The implication was both encouraging and terrifying. If Thomas had successfully mapped a safe route to Baron Ashworth, they had a significant advantage over their pursuers. But if the Shadow Council had caught and killed Thomas along this same path, then they knew the terrain as well and might be positioning themselves for an ambush at any of several choke points ahead. The morning wore on with the steady rhythm of hard travel through difficult country, punctuated by brief halts to rest the horses and listen for sounds of pursuit. Each time they stopped, the forest around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the trees themselves understood the deadly nature of the game being played beneath their branches. At midday, they reached a clearing where a small stream provided fresh water and a brief opportunity to assess their situation. The old bay horse drank deeply, but remained alert, its ears pricked forward as if listening to sounds only it could detect. Edmund studied their back trail through a spyglass, searching for signs that their enemies had successfully followed their route. "I see movement about 2 miles behind us," he reported grimly. "At least 4 riders, maybe more. They're moving methodically, checking every branch and turn, but they're definitely on our trail." The pursuit was closer than Alaric had hoped, but not yet close enough to force desperate measures. If they could maintain their current pace for another few hours, they would reach the river crossing that marked the halfway point to Ashworth Castle. Beyond that lay territory where Baron Ashworth's influence would provide some protection against open attack. But the old bay horse had begun displaying signs of increasing agitation, pawing at the ground and snorting softly as it stared toward a section of forest that appeared no different from any other. As Alaric watched, the animal moved deliberately toward what seemed to be a solid wall of undergrowth, stopping only when its muzzle touched a tangle of vines and branches that concealed something beneath. "What is it?" Edmund asked, following Alaric's gaze toward the horse's strange behavior. The answer came when Alaric pushed aside the concealing vegetation and discovered beneath it the weathered remains of a wooden cross, carved with symbols that matched those he had seen in his father's secret documents. This was more than a trail marker. It was a grave, and from the size and placement, it could only belong to one person, Thomas, he said quietly, kneeling beside the simple memorial that someone had created in the years since the stable hand's death. He made it this far before they caught him. The discovery cast their entire journey in a different light. They were not simply fleeing toward safety. They were following in the footsteps of a man who had died attempting the same mission, traveling a route that had already claimed the life of their predecessor. The Shadow Council knew this path intimately because they had used it to hunt down and kill the last person who had tried to expose their crimes. But Thomas's death had not been in vain. Hidden beneath the cross, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected it from decay, was a final message that completed the picture of the Shadow. Council's operations and provided the names of allies who might still be trusted to act on evidence of their crimes. The document was brief but devastating in its implications. A complete list of Shadow Council members, their areas of responsibility, and the methods they used to communicate and coordinate their activities. More importantly, it identified Baron Ashworth as the leader of a counter-conspiracy that had been working for years to gather evidence against the Shadow Council and expose their crimes to the king. This changes everything. Edmund breathed as he read the document over Alaric's shoulder. If Baron Ashworth has been actively investigating the Shadow Council, then our arrival at his castle won't be a desperate plea for help. It will be the completion of a plan that's been in motion for decades. The old bay horse nickered softly, as if expressing satisfaction that its long guardianship of secrets was finally nearing completion. Thomas had died before he could deliver this final piece of evidence to Baron Ashworth. But his sacrifice had preserved the truth long enough for Duke Aldwyn's son to finish what both men had started. As they prepared to resume their journey, Alaric felt the weight of legacy and responsibility settling over him like a mantle passed from father to son across generations. He was no longer simply fleeing for his life or seeking personal revenge. He was carrying forward a cause that had already claimed the lives of good men, and which might yet demand his own blood before justice was achieved. The Shadow Council had shaped his entire adult life through lies and manipulation, but they had also unwittingly prepared him for this moment when their own carefully crafted weapon would be turned against them. The skills they had taught him, the reputation they had helped him build, and the strategic thinking they had fostered would all be used to destroy the organization that had created them. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing closer, but ahead lay the promise of allies and justice. The final confrontation was approaching, and this time, the Shadow Council would face an enemy who understood their methods and possessed the evidence needed to expose their crimes. The game his father had died playing was entering its final moves, and Alaric intended to win it. The river crossing appeared through the trees like a promise of salvation. Its shallow ford, marking the boundary between territories controlled by different noble houses. Once they crossed these waters, they would be under Baron Ashworth's protection, where even the Shadow Council would hesitate to act openly against them. But the old bay horse had stopped at the forest's edge, refusing to approach the water despite Edmund's gentle urging. The animal stood perfectly still, every muscle tense with alarm, its dark eyes fixed on the far bank where nothing appeared to be moving among the willows and rushes. "What do you see?" Alaric asked softly, trusting the instincts that had guided them safely this far. Edmund raised his spyglass and studied the crossing point with methodical precision, searching for any sign of the threat that had set the horse on edge. For long minutes he found nothing suspicious, just the peaceful scene of a rural ford where travelers had crossed for generations. Then, sunlight glinted off something metallic hidden among the reeds on the far shore. "Crossbow bolts," Edmund reported grimly. "At least 3 positions, maybe more. They're waiting in ambush, positioned to catch us in the water, where we'd be helpless." The Shadow Council had anticipated their route and moved ahead to set a trap at the most vulnerable point of their journey. Thomas's path to safety had become a carefully planned killing ground, where his modern followers would meet the same fate that had claimed their predecessor. "Can we find another crossing?" Alaric asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The next ford is 8 miles downstream, through territory they'll have covered as thoroughly as this one. And our pursuers are no more than an hour behind us. We don't have time for detours." The tactical situation was precisely the sort of impossible choice that Alaric had faced in military campaigns, where every option led to disaster, but inaction meant certain death. They couldn't retreat, couldn't advance, and couldn't remain where they were without being trapped between 2 enemy forces. But the old bay horse had begun displaying the purposeful behavior that meant it had remembered something important from Thomas's training. The animal moved along the riverbank, stopping frequently to test the ground with its hooves and examine the water's depth with the careful attention of a creature that understood the difference between safe passage and deadly trap. What it found was a game trail that led upstream to a section of river where ancient trees had fallen across the water, creating a natural bridge that would be invisible to anyone watching the main crossing. Thomas had scouted multiple routes, and his faithful companion remembered them all. "The horse knows another way," Alaric said, following the animal as it picked its way carefully along the riverbank. Thomas planned for this exact situation. The fallen trees proved sturdy enough to support their weight, though crossing required them to lead their horses carefully across mossy logs that were slippery with moisture and decay. It was slow, dangerous work that left them vulnerable if they were spotted, but it allowed them to reach the far bank without exposing themselves to the crossbow ambush waiting at the ford. As they reached safety on the opposite shore, the sounds of their pursuers finally became audible through the forest behind them, the crash of horses moving at speed through undergrowth, the shouts of men coordinating their search pattern, and the distinctive whistle signals used by professional trackers to communicate without alerting their quarry. "They've found our trail," Edmund said quietly. "We have perhaps 10 minutes before they reach the crossing point. 10 minutes to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the killing ground that had been prepared for them. 10 minutes to reach terrain where Baron Ashworth's patrols might spot them and provide escort to the safety of his castle. 10 minutes to complete a mission that had already cost too many lives and could not be allowed to fail again." They rode hard through countryside that gradually became more civilized, with well-maintained roads and prosperous farms that spoke of competent governance and protection from bandits and raiders. These were lands where the rule of law meant something, where the Shadow Council's influence was constrained by the presence of authorities who could not be bought or intimidated. The old bay horse led them unerringly toward their destination, following paths that Thomas had mapped 15 years ago in his desperate flight toward justice. The animal's memory was perfect, its sense of direction uncanny, its determination to complete its master's final mission absolute. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western horizon, the towers of Ashworth Castle came into view, a fortress that had stood for 3 centuries as a bastion of honor in a world increasingly corrupted by the Shadow Council's influence. Baron Ashworth had been Duke Aldwin's closest friend and ally, the one man in the kingdom who could be trusted absolutely with the evidence they carried. But even as safety beckoned from across the final valley, Alaric could hear the distant sound of pursuit growing closer. The Shadow Council's agents had followed their trail with ruthless efficiency, and the race to reach Ashworth's protection would be decided by minutes rather than hours. The old bay horse seemed to understand that everything depended on these final moments. With a burst of speed that belied its age, the animal surged forward toward the castle gates, carrying with it the hopes of the dead and the last chance for justice that had been 15 years in the making. The gates of Ashworth Castle stood open as they approached, but not in welcome. They gaped like a mouth frozen in a scream of warning. The courtyard beyond was eerily quiet, with no sign of the bustling activity that should have marked a functioning fortress. Even the sentries, who should have challenged their approach, were nowhere to be seen. Edmund pulled his horse to a halt just outside bow range, his weathered face pale with understanding. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "I think we're too late." The realization hit Alaric like a physical blow. The Shadow Council had not simply been pursuing them. They had been driving them toward a destination that was no longer safe. Baron Ashworth's castle had been taken, its lord either captured or killed, its garrison eliminated or suborned. The sanctuary they had risked everything to reach had become another trap in the web their enemies had woven around them. But the old bay horse continued forward with unwavering determination, as if it sensed something the men could not perceive. The animal's behavior had been their guide and salvation throughout this journey, and Alaric found himself following, despite the obvious danger ahead. They passed beneath the raised portcullis and into the courtyard, where the silence was broken only by the sound of their horses' hooves on ancient cobblestones. The castle's windows stared down at them like empty eyes, revealing nothing of what had happened to its defenders or what fate awaited its unwelcome visitors. Then, from the shadows of the main hall, stepped a figure that made Alaric's blood freeze with recognition and rage. Lord Blackthorne emerged with the casual confidence of a man who controlled every aspect of the situation, flanked by armed men who wore the livery of Ashworth's household, but whose eyes held the cold calculation of professional killers. "Welcome to Ashworth Castle, my dear boy," Blackthorne said with the same paternal warmth he had always shown, as if they were meeting for a pleasant social gathering rather than the climax of a deadly game. "I must say you've led us quite a chase. Your father would have been proud of your resourcefulness." The casual mention of Duke Aldwin was calculated cruelty, designed to provoke an emotional response that would give Blackthorne psychological advantage in the confrontation to come. But Alaric had learned too much about manipulation and control to be easily baited by such obvious tactics. "Where is Baron Ashworth?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would not be one he wanted to hear, resting peacefully in the castle's chapel, I'm afraid. The poor man suffered a sudden attack of the heart when he learned of your investigation into certain historical matters. These elderly lords are so fragile, aren't they? The slightest shock can prove fatal to men of their advanced years. Another murder disguised as natural death. Another ally eliminated before he could act on the evidence that might have exposed the Shadow Council's crimes. Baron Ashworth had died as Duke Aldwyn had died, as Thomas had died, as countless others had died across the decades, victims of a conspiracy that killed with the methodical efficiency of a plague. You've been planning this for weeks, Alaric realized. The pursuit, the ambush at the ford, driving us here to what we thought was safety. All of it orchestrated to bring us exactly where you wanted us. Months, actually, Blackthorne corrected with evident pride in his strategic planning. From the moment you purchased that damned horse at the village auction, we knew it was only a matter of time before you stumbled across inconvenient truths. The animal was too distinctive, too connected to events we had taken considerable trouble to bury. The admission revealed the extent of the Shadow Council's intelligence network and their long-term thinking. They had been watching and planning, while Alaric believed himself to be conducting a secret investigation, manipulating his discoveries and directing his path toward this final confrontation where they could eliminate all threats to their continued operation. But they had made one crucial error in their calculations. Edmund was no longer the elderly steward they had dismissed as irrelevant. He was a man with decades of military experience who had spent years planning for this exact moment. The loyal retainer stepped forward with the smooth motion of a professional soldier, a crossbow appearing in his hands as if conjured from thin air. "I think not, my lord," Edmund said calmly, his weapon trained on Blackthorne's chest. "You see, Baron Ashworth and I have been corresponding for 15 years, planning for the day when Duke Aldwyn's son would be ready to carry forward his father's work. The men you see wearing Ashworth livery are indeed his household guards, loyal to their true master rather than to the gold you offered them." The revelation transformed the tactical situation in an instant. The armed men Alaric had assumed were enemies stepped aside to reveal genuine Ashworth retainers emerging from concealment throughout the courtyard. Their weapons trained on Blackthorne's small group of companions. The trap had become a counter-trap, the hunters had become the hunted, and the Shadow Council's careful planning had been turned against them by men who understood their methods and had spent years preparing for this confrontation. But Blackthorne's expression showed no fear or surprise, only the calculating assessment of a man who had faced and overcome desperate situations before. His hand moved toward the weapon at his belt, with the practiced ease of someone who had killed more often than he cared to remember, and Alaric realized that the final confrontation was only beginning. The game his father had died playing was about to reach its conclusion, but the outcome remained far from certain. The standoff lasted only moments before Blackthorne made his move, his sword clearing its scabbard with the fluid motion of a master swordsman who had killed in closer quarters than courtly duels. But age and arrogance had made him overconfident. He had forgotten that the young man he faced was no longer the grieving teenager he had manipulated, but a battle-tested warrior who had learned from the best teacher of all, Blackthorne himself. Steel rang against steel in the castle courtyard as mentor and student fought with the deadly precision of men who understood that only one would leave alive. Blackthorne was skilled and experienced, but Alaric was younger, faster, and driven by 15 years of suppressed rage that had finally found its target. The duel ended when Blackthorne's blade, weakened by age and poor maintenance, shattered against Alaric's perfectly maintained weapon. The man who had murdered Duke Aldwyn fell to his knees in the same courtyard, where he had planned to eliminate the last threat to the Shadow Council's power. "It's over," Alaric said, his sword point resting against his father's killer's throat. "The evidence is documented, the witnesses are protected, and your network is exposed. The Shadow Council dies with you. But Blackthorn's final words carried the bitter laughter of a man who understood games within games better than his young opponent. You think this ends with me? The council is larger than you imagine, deeper than you've discovered. Kill me, and 3 others will take my place before the year is out. The kingdom needs us, boy. Without our guidance, the realm would collapse into chaos within a generation. He was still talking, still manipulating, still believing that words could accomplish what violence had failed to achieve. Alaric ended the monologue with a quick thrust that silenced forever the voice that had shaped his life through lies and murder, the Shadow Council's network proved to be as vulnerable as Blackthorn had claimed it was necessary. With their leadership eliminated and their methods exposed, the remaining members scattered like leaves before a winter wind. Some fled the kingdom entirely. Others attempted to bargain for mercy by revealing additional secrets. And a few chose death rather than face the justice they had avoided for so long. The evidence gathered by Duke Alaric, preserved by Thomas, and completed by Alaric painted a picture of corruption so comprehensive that the king was forced to reform entire institutions to root out the conspiracy's influence. Military commands were reorganized, noble titles were revoked, and new laws were enacted to prevent such systematic abuse of power from occurring again. But for Alaric, the most meaningful victory was not political but personal. The truth about his father's character and the real reason for his death restored a relationship that had been poisoned by years of believing Duke Alaric had abandoned his family through weakness. Duke Alaric had died as a hero rather than a victim, fighting for justice rather than succumbing to frailty. 6 months after Blackthorn's death, Alaric stood in the eastern pasture of Ravenshollow, watching the old bay horse graze peacefully beneath the oak tree where Thomas had once sought shelter. The animal had grown fat and content in its retirement, greeted with the honor due a veteran of dangerous campaigns successfully completed. "You did it, old friend," he said softly, stroking the horse's neck with the gentle affection that had grown between them. "Thomas would be proud of what we accomplished together." The horse nickered softly and nuzzled his shoulder, then turned its attention back to the sweet grass and the simple pleasures of a life lived in safety. The mission was complete, the secrets were revealed, and the long guardianship was finally over. In the months that followed, Alaric transformed from a bitter exile into a leader his people could respect and trust. Ravenshollow flourished under his careful management. The estate's lands were restored to productivity, and the Duke's reputation shifted from feared warrior to beloved protector of justice. He found love with Eleanor Whitmore, a widow from the neighboring county whose husband had been another of the Shadow Council's victims. Their marriage was built on shared understanding of loss and mutual commitment to preventing such tragedies from occurring again. The small wooden horse that Thomas had carved during his lonely vigils became the centerpiece of a memorial garden planted behind the village chapel. Children played around it while their parents told stories of the stable hand who had died protecting their lord, and the faithful horse that had carried his secrets to safety across 15 years of patient waiting. Edmund remained as steward, but his role evolved beyond estate management to become keeper of the truth and guardian of the evidence that had exposed the Shadow Council. The hidden chamber beneath the manor was transformed into a library where scholars could study the methods of corruption and learn to recognize the signs of such conspiracies before they could take root again. Martha continued to rule the kitchen with loving tyranny, but she also became the unofficial historian of the events that had changed their world. Her detailed accounts of Thomas's character and the old bay horse's remarkable intelligence became part of the official record that would guide future generations in understanding how ordinary courage could triumph over extraordinary evil. On the anniversary of his father's death, Alaric established a tradition that would continue for generations. Each year, he would visit Thomas's grave in the forest, bringing fresh flowers and speaking aloud the names of all who had died seeking justice. Then he would return to Raven's Hollow and spend the evening in the eastern pasture with the old bay horse, sharing quiet conversation about the past and hope for the future. Years later, when the horse finally died peacefully in its sleep beneath the oak tree, Alaric buried it beside Thomas's grave with full honors befitting a hero of the realm. The memorial stone bore a simple inscription: "Faithful unto death, guardian of truth, companion of courage." But the story did not end with death. It continued with new life and renewed purpose. Eleanor bore him 3 children who grew up knowing the true history of their family and the cost of the peace they inherited. The eldest son, named Aldwin in honor of his grandfather, showed early signs of the scholarly curiosity that had driven his namesake to seek dangerous truths. The youngest child, a daughter named Catherine, after the mysterious woman whose portrait had been part of the evidence against the Shadow Council, inherited her father's military instincts and her grandfather's moral courage. She would grow up to become a formidable defender of justice in her own right, carrying forward the family tradition of standing against corruption wherever it might arise. On quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and his family gathered around the great hall's fireplace, Alaric would sometimes tell the story of how a single act of compassion, buying an unwanted horse at a village auction, had led to the exposure of a conspiracy that had poisoned the kingdom for decades. The tale always ended the same way, with the reminder that evil flourished only when good people chose to look away, and that even the smallest gestures of kindness could change the world if they were offered with genuine love and maintained with stubborn hope. The old bay horse was gone, but its legacy lived on in the restored honor of the Raven's Hollow name, the reformed institutions of the kingdom, and the unshakable belief that truth, however long buried, would eventually find a way to surface through the devotion of those who refused to let it die. In the end, Thomas's sacrifice had not been in vain. Duke Aldwin's death had not been meaningless, and the Shadow Council's crimes had not gone unpunished. Justice had been served not through the grand gestures of kings and armies, but through the quiet heroism of ordinary people who chose to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. And in the eastern pasture of Raven's Hollow, beneath an oak tree that had sheltered generations of dreamers and defenders, the grass grew green and sweet, nourished by the memory of a faithful horse that had carried the hopes of the dead to safety in the hands of the living.